Welcome, everybody. My name is Melanie Brooks, and I am the audience coordinator for the Bangor Daily News. Welcome to our online event. Tonight, we're going to be talking about invasive plants and pests in Maine's forests. And I want to begin tonight by thanking our event partner, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. We have Bill Whitmore here with us. He is the Maine Vice President at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and I'm going to let him say a couple of words of welcome. Go ahead, Bill.
Great, thanks, Melanie. Thanks everybody for joining this evening. It's funny, I did this a week or so ago, and George Danby, the editorial cartoonist, was on from the Bangor Daily, and I actually recognized some faces and names on here from that last event. So thanks for joining. Thanks to the Bangor Daily for, and particularly for Melanie, for all their work to put together these meetings. They're informative. There's something to do while we're all kind of stuck at home. It's a great way to do outreach to our communities. So tonight, and thanks to Mike and Jesse for joining and offering up their expertise for people to listen to and ask questions. Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare is really happy to partner with the Bangor Daily News and sponsor these events. We're a very community-oriented health insurance company, nonprofit, but we spend a lot of money endorsing and supporting things like this. Just on a personal note, I want to quickly say, Jesse being from Acadia National Park, I grew up in Ellsworth. My dad taught for 35 years, and then his retirement job was a park ranger at the visitor centers in Acadia. I'm going to hold this up. This might not work, but I'm going to do it anyway. That's my dad in his home relaxing after work in his park ranger hat. So it's fond memories for me. He's been gone for quite a long time, but it's always nice to connect to Acadia. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the show, and thanks for coming.
Maine really is a small world, isn't it? Bill, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your words of welcome. Your support is really appreciated, and we're happy to have you with us tonight, and we're happy to have all of you with us tonight. For those of you joining who are subscribers, welcome. Your support means a lot to us, and there might be some of you who are joining us for the first time, and I hope it's not the last time. We do about 4 of these a month, so we hope you come back and join us for another one. So we have 2 really special guests tonight that I'm really excited that joined us. Mike Parisio is a forest entomologist with the Maine Forest Service, and he joined the MFS Insect and Disease Lab in May 2019. And Jesse Wheeler has been Acadia National Park's Vegetation Program Manager since September 2019. So we're going to take a little bit of time, and I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, and we have a slideshow to present to you. We want to hear your voices, and we want to know what kind of questions you have. So if you wouldn't mind, there's a lot of you here, and I'm so happy to see you. If you have a question for Mike or Jesse, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and send in a question. You can send it in to everyone, or you can send it to me. And once our presentation is over, we'll spend the second half of the event answering your questions. And I'm sure you all have some. So please don't be afraid to ask. So I'm going to give Mike and Jesse a few minutes to tell you about what they do in their jobs. So Mike, do you want to go first?
Certainly. Thank you for having me, Melanie. We appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk about forest, insect, and disease issues. So as you said, I am one of 3, in addition to our state entomologist, I'm one of 3 forest entomologists that works for the Maine Forest Service. We also have a forest pathologist on staff here at the Insect and Disease Lab, in addition to several other wonderful field entomology technicians that do a great job running around during the trapping season all summer. So what I do on the job here, I would say probably depends on the day and the time of season. So for example, today I've already been back and forth from Augusta to Presque Isle, flying aerial survey looking for forest disturbance, mainly insect issues in that part of the state. But again, that's just an example of one of the many things that we do. So at this time of year, I would say the majority of our time goes towards public requests for assistance. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to provide whatever information and assistance we can to the public. So we feel the numerous phone calls during the busy time of year here when all the insect and disease issues are really active. in the normal world, that usually would involve quite a few field visits, after those phone calls, but increasingly more and more we're asking people to submit photos and text photos and things along those lines so we can get some of that identification work done, and then provide whatever information we need to in terms of management recommendations or other tips and advice like that. So that ranges from anything from, a single plant in a backyard or a particular insect that somebody has a curiosity about to, large woodlot owners or industrial woodland owners. So yeah, it really runs the gamut there. So also during this time of year, we're doing a lot of insect and disease monitoring. So we have quite a few programs. Personally, I'm heavily involved on the spruce budworm monitoring program, and I also oversee a lot of the quarantine regulations for quarantine insects here in the state of Maine. So yeah, we kind of divide those programs up among our staff entomologists, and everybody has a few programs, but we all kind of lend a hand wherever's needed and have a hand in all of that stuff. So yeah, we spend the majority of the growing season doing that, and then come fall and winter, it's a lot of looking at that information, preparing reports, extending that information to wherever it needs to go. And then, yeah, we also provide a ton of outreach. Again, in a normal world, we're usually doing, a large amount of public presentations and stuff like that wherever we're requested. But, we've been increasingly doing things like this, webinars, online learning and stuff like that. So we're happy to do that as well. And that's basically it in a nutshell. So like I said, we try to manage all the insects of concern and keep track of everything going on in the state. So we have records to compare and, lend a hand and some advice wherever we can. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much. Jesse, you're up.
Hey, thanks, Melanie. Thanks for inviting me here. So I'm Acadia's vegetation program manager. I work in resource management, and essentially what I do is kind of tasked to protecting our native plant resources in the park. And it kind of divides up into different directions from there. Some of it's kind of protecting, the plants from internal kind of harm, and that could be just, conducting rare plant inventories for areas that might see construction or trail rehab and things like that. But it's also protecting our plant resources from external threats or external harms. And so that's often stuff that's hard to do a lot of prevention of, but so that gets into the invasive species realm. It's also keeping an eye out on forest health issues, both the short term and also the long term. So that brings in the invasive plant and insect kind of components there for monitoring and management. It's also working with partners, neighbors, researchers on kind of some long range planning and external threats like environmental change, climate change, and trying to get to adaptation and try to see what we can do for looking at maybe restoration methods, and maybe looking at what kinds of species are going to do well here, what species aren't. So there's a lot of thought that goes into conservation planning that I tend to be involved with. And as the vegetation manager, kind of the plant subject matter expert, I guess, working with other park staff in that. I also mentioned, since I have been working in this position for less than a year, I have been working at Acadia since 2010, doing forest health work as well as invasive plant management. And so I've got probably about 10 years of the kind of work heavily involved in plant management, but as well as looking at long range kind of forest problems. And that could be something sort of like looking at forest structure and composition and kind of native plants and how they're doing. And so that's it for right now.
Thanks both of you for giving us a little overview of what it is that you do. I am going to share my screen. We have a slideshow of pests and plants that Mike and Jesse are going to walk us through. So hold tight. All right, so we are going to start with the pests side. And Mike, when you're ready for me to change the slide, you just let me know.
Sure thing, and it is up on the screen. It's not in full screen though. Doesn't particularly matter, and if I ramble on too long, you can cut me right off. But Okay, yeah, well, Melanie is figuring that out. I can go ahead and get started. So the first invasive insect I'm going to talk about today on my short list is emerald ash borers. So hopefully those of you that are interested in attending an event like this have already heard of emerald ash borer, but if you haven't, this is really one of the important invasive species to be aware of. And it's relatively new to Maine. We didn't enjoy the company of emerald ash borer until 2018, whereas it's been in the country for quite a while, detected in the early 2000s and probably here since the 1990s or 1980s perhaps. But anyways, it was introduced or detected into the greater Detroit area in Michigan there. And in the span of just a couple of decades here, it's pretty much expanded to occupy the entire native range of our eastern ash species, which is what it feeds on, hence the name. So yeah, this is a very damaging invasive species, the most damaging invasive insect in North American history at this point. It's surpassed everything else in terms of damage, but yes, feeds specifically on our ashes, but it is basically almost 100% lethal to them. So the one thing I do want to point out, you know, the whole reason for that movement from Michigan to, you know, why we're talking about this in Maine today. Although the insect is a very capable flyer, it really moves well unknowingly in things like firewood and other forest products. So that picture there on the right, that's actually an ash tree with the bark removed. And you can see the insect galleries. So they're very unique for emerald ash borer. We call them serpentine or S-shaped there. Really not like any of our native insects that attack ash. So this is something I want people to really be on the lookout for, you know, be very conscious of not moving firewood, buying it locally, using it locally, you know, trying to limit the movement of firewood that transports invasive species like emerald ash borer as much as possible. Will do a great deal of good for preserving Maine's forest research for as long as possible. So. Okay, you can go ahead and move on to the next one, Melanie, please.
Why don't you talk about browntail moth and I will see what I can do.
Okay, well, the cat is out of the bag. That was the next slide. So maybe I don't even have to show people what browntail moth looks like. Maybe everybody already knows. So if you hadn't heard of emerald ash borer, I'm sure if you live in Maine or, you know, do anything in Maine vacation, you've heard of browntail moth. So this is the latest insect that has really taken Maine by storm, and it's an interesting history. It's been here a very long time, you know, going back to the 19th century even. So when it was initially introduced, it expanded its range quite a bit all over New England and up into the Canadian Maritimes. And then for whatever reason, when natural enemies started to control the populations, there we go, now I see it. The population has really shrunk back to the Maine coast and some areas near Cape Cod. And then it was very quiet for a long time and therefore, unfortunately, not a very well studied insect up until recently. But now that we're having all these problems with it, more and more people are looking at ways to manage it. So hopefully help is on the way. But I bring up this, you know, first and foremost, you know, it is a forest pest and it does a little bit of damage to the trees, but everybody should really be aware of the public health risk associated with browntail moth. So as you can see on those caterpillars there, those hairs are toxic and they can cause quite a nasty skin rash to sensitive individuals, and also respiratory issues as they can become airborne. And that's been quite a problem this year. So we really benefit from cold, wet weather in the spring that causes a lot of natural disease and death in these caterpillars, which we did not have. So really good survivorship, really dry weather there for a while. So lots of browntail moth caterpillars and lots of airborne hairs in the dry weather and stuff like that. So please educate yourself about browntail moth and protect yourself. We have a lot of online resources for that. You can go ahead and skip ahead, Melanie, please.
Do you see the next one, or am I?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, here's another one that's kind of, you know, not always in the limelight, but an important one nonetheless. Hemlock woolly Adelgid, pretty inconspicuous and pretty small insect. If you're familiar with hemlock there, you can see, you know, the size of hemlock needles and cones there. So very small, but what it lacks in size, it makes up for in numbers. So basically, this is an insect that attacks the fine twigs of hemlock trees and causes dieback and mortality in severe situations, which we don't tend to see that much in Maine at this point in time, but certainly in the southern part of hemlock's range, yeah, it's really a devastating problem in the mountains down there in the Carolinas and that area. But anyways, I bring this one up because I love birds. Lots of people love birds, and one of the ways that the crawlers, the mobile phase of hemlock woolly adelgid, gets around are by people feeding the birds. So you know, one thing we can all do in terms of cultural control is limit the periods of the year where we do feed birds. So keep it limited to the winter months, you know, and kind of take down the feeders in March through the summer. And you know, that's good for a number of reasons. You know, we all know about nuisance bear problems and other nuisance animals, so we can avoid not only nuisance animal problems by not feeding the birds at certain times of the years, but also, you know, unintentional spread of things like hemlock woolly adelgid here. Okay. Okay, another one I'll jump to. This is Asian longhorn beetle. So this is a beetle that is not yet here in Maine, but this is one that we are really keeping an intent eye out for. And it just actually made the news again. They discovered a new infestation in South Carolina that's quite extensive and has been there for quite a long time. So that's one of the problems with invasive species like emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle. They exist for a long time and their populations build up very quickly, you know, before we realize what's going on. And once those populations are really in place, it's very difficult to get back ahead of them. So Asian longhorn beetle, there has been quite some success with management. It's not a very fast-moving beetle on its own, so there is management that can be done to local populations. But again, this is a classic example of a species that can move in firewood unintentionally like that. And we do have several native longhorn beetles of this size that you know, we get calls about all the time. People thinking they have Asian longhorn beetle, and those are the calls we love because, you know, we'd much rather, you know that it's one of the native species instead of accidentally an Asian longhorn beetle that goes unreported. So it's certainly in the realm of things that can show up in Maine, and one that we don't want to forget about, and we definitely don't want here because there is a ton of food available to them up here. They have a very wide host range, and they would certainly make a happy home in Maine. So we'd like to prevent that as best we can. Okay. And then switching gears from the insect world, I wanted to talk about oak wilt, which is an invasive fungus. So like I said, we all dabble a little bit in both sides of forest health, both entomology and pathology. So this is another really important species we want to keep an eye out for. So really doing a tremendous amount of damage in the upper Midwest, but it is creeping its way over into the Northeast here. The closest known infestation area is in Glenville, New York, so not very far away. Unfortunately, that infestation is under management, but certainly, again, something that can travel in firewood. And yeah, with everything going on with COVID and people, you know, doing a lot of extra yard work and stuff like that, this is something you can keep an eye out for during your yard work. So it's a very aggressive fungus, especially on the red oaks, which is the majority of the oaks here in Maine. So it can kill a mature tree, as you can see in that picture on the right there, you know, within the span of just a month or two. So if you see, you know, massive amounts of leaf drop on oak trees on your lawn, you know, at a time of year when they should be holding on to their leaves, you know, we want to hear about that. And it does have this unique discoloration there where the innards of the leaf tend to stay green there, and the outer margins are the ones that become discolored, like that picture on the left. So again, in simple cultural things we can do, this disease spreads one of two ways. So the first is underground through root grafting, which requires quite a bit of sophisticated management to try to deal with. And then the above ground route of spread is any time that there is a wound on an oak tree, there's sap beetles that are attracted to it, and they feed on that sap from any wound. And they're the ones that actually can pick up the spores from the fungus on an infected tree and then carry it to a wound on a healthy tree that just has, you know, a broken branch or something like that. So again, when we're doing yard work, you know, it's tempting to make everything look very tidy, but we can avoid pruning during the vulnerable months here in the summer here to reduce that risk of overland or above ground spread of oak wilt via beetles. So again, that's another one where we're keeping a close eye out for and doing as much outreach right now as we can before it shows up here in the state. So that's all I have for my my 5 slides. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to pass it on over to Jesse to take over.
Okay, thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so I'm going to show you guys 5 species that tend to be kind of most problematic here at Acadia. And also mention that the photos I'm sharing with you are ones as local as possible. They're from Acadia National Park, so I hope that they give you as good of a representation of what they might be doing in the forests and woodlands in Maine, in eastern Maine. So also start by mentioning that we have a dedicated invasive plant management team here at Acadia, which is fantastic. 2 to 5 seasonal workforce that work solely on removing invasive plants. We also monitor for treatment effectiveness and create management plans for all these species. Almost about a quarter to a third of the plant species in Acadia are non-native. However, we really have about 24, about 25 that are priority kind of invasive plants. And so these are the top 5-ish, I'll say, of that 24 that we manage on a yearly basis. So this first one here is Japanese barberry. And the reason I'm going to try to kick off with this one is that because I feel like this is one of our more problematic for forest health, long-term forest health in general. So this is a shrub that originally from Japan and Asia, introduced here in North America as hedges and ornamental planting, so you may be familiar with it. It leaves out really early in the spring, a lot sooner than a lot of our native plants. So what it does is it ends up giving it a competitive advantage, and so it does a lot better than our native shrubs. It has small leaves with no teeth or lobes, so it's kind of smooth, alternate arrangement. It has if you look at the red circle in the upper right picture, it may be hard to tell, but it has a single thorn that kind of sticks out at the base of the leaf that's pretty distinguishable. So you don't want to grab these things without some gloves on. It'll develop red berries in late summer and will stick on until winter. So you can see there from the left-hand picture there. We tend to see this thing spreading through by waterways and through wildlife. So Mike mentioned, how birds certainly will be, transporting an invasive pest line. And same thing happens here. Turkey, grouse, and other wildlife may eat these berries and spread them along the forest. So it kind of can pop up anywhere, and it does relatively well under a shady canopy. Sorry, I'm laughing because we were talking before we started this about ticks, and the ticks seem to come up subject matter with any kind of discussion about natural resources in Maine or recreation in Maine. I'll mention that this one here, when you have a forest with dense understories of Japanese barberries, it's been shown, studies have shown that it'll contribute to an increase of black-legged tick, or the deer tick, as well as increased incidence of Lyme disease. So another one with this particular species I stress is that it's problematic for forest health, but it's also a public health issue. Or we can go to the next one. So this one, shrubby honeysuckle or exotic bush honeysuckle. There's actually a couple of species and some hybrids that grow around here. One of the more common ones is Maro's honeysuckle. This one is in a similar category with the barberry. It's a shrub that was introduced from Asia here as an ornamental and for windbreaks originally, until it escaped. You also might find it along old home sites and foundations. It has oppositely arranged leaves with small hairs on the bottom of the leaf. It also has, so it comes out relatively early in the spring, not quite as early as barberry, but it certainly leaves out, and it has yellow or white flowers. You can see a little bit from the kind of background image in June. And then it will then get these orange to reddish berries that'll develop in midsummer. You can see on the left-hand side there, that left-hand picture is a large, large fellow that that was on one of our overlook vistas on the Park Loop Road a couple years ago. Anyhow, so this one does, you know, the orange and red mature fruit that's there that looks really tasty for our birds. However, it's got a poor nutritional value. So if you've got migrating songbirds coming through and eating these, they're just going to be spreading seed and not actually getting much nutritional value out of it. So it's kind of a double negative there. We find that, interestingly enough, at least on the coast of Maine, on some of the outer islands that are part of Acadia National Park and ones that I've visited, it can be problematic popping up on those islands. And I think so part of that may be how the seed disperses with wildlife, but I think a lot of these things, it kind of, you got to look at the history of the land use history and what's gone on the landscape over the last decades or maybe even longer. And I think anywhere that you have kind of old fields that are kind of, you know, left abandoned or old cleared areas in Maine, like a lot of our islands were, then, you know, these invasives do super well. That's why they are invasive, is they do well to colonize open areas and outcompete our native vegetation. So I think that's why ones like shrubby honeysuckle does pretty well on our islands and can be problematic. So we certainly do manage them on our islands as well as the other sections of Acadia. I'll also mention that this one, not so much the picture in the middle there, but when you get a larger twig that's about, you know, kind of a 2-year-old, you can slice it and look at the middle of the stem. It'll have a hollow stem, and that's one way to identify it. All right, great. So now we have glossy buckthorn on the screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. This one, and just kind of going in stature height level here, this one is also a shrub, but it grows a little bit taller, more like 10 to 15 feet high. But it's a pretty shade tolerant understory shrub that does like wetlands, like the picture below on the right, and wet meadow areas. It also likes forested wetlands, like the main picture that you see here. That's pretty much all glossy buckthorn on a red maple swamp near Certamonts in the park. And this one is it's very, very problematic. So if we're talking about, you know, what are we doing here at the park, and what do I also see happening in Maine, is that this species is so prolific. It has an ability to spread and get started in many different habitats. So we find it in these wet areas. We also find it on the ridges of the mountains and wet seeps, and we find it almost growing in salt marshes and kind of all over. So it does a really good job at establishing once the seed is spread. This one is originally from Europe and Central Asia. Brought here as an ornamental in the late 1800s. It's used for wildlife and then revegetation projects, mostly in the kind of Midwest before it started to spread and folks realized it was behaving badly. It is got glossy or shiny leaves. You can kind of see from the upper right photo, hence the name glossy buckthorn. Although it doesn't actually have thorns, this particular species, some of its relatives do. So it has these smooth leaves and smooth or what's called entire margins of the leaf. So you won't find teeth or lobes on there, and pretty indented veins of the leaf. The flowers are small, not very showy in the spring, but they will develop into these first green and then mature into red and then eventually dark purple into black berries by late summer. And we've seen just, you know, 2-year-old seedlings really starting, you know, for the right conditions, starting to set fruit on this. So again, that's kind of, again, it's probably its best competitive advantage is that it sets a lot of seed. So Asiatic bittersweet, this one is a vine. So although it may not do such a great job at invading intact forest, kind of shaded woodlands, it gets started on kind of the edge. It needs a little bit more sunlight. But once it gets started, it does a really good job of climbing its way up and out. So you can see that what it can do is it can climb up trees, girdling them or kind of basically choking them and eventually bringing them down. This picture on the left is at Sand Beach. You can kind of see the Asiatic bittersweet in the foreground starting to overtake an already dead shrub there. This one is interesting that that we find it almost cropping up anywhere. And again, that may be just how the seeds are spread, or its ability to germinate in just like a tiny bit of disturbed soil. This vine was introduced in the mid-1800s, again, as an ornamental. It's kind of a common story. And we often find it associated with home sites and also roadsides where it was originally planted for erosion control. The vine, it has alternate leaves, so meaning alternately arranged, meaning they kind of go one right after another along the stem as opposed to opposite. And so you want to look for that when you see some vines, and then the leaf shape has these small serrations or teeth on the upper half of the leaf coming to a point that will show this. We don't really have any native vines that look like this, other than there is American bittersweet. It's a relatively rare plant, actually, and we don't have much around here, but this one, it behaves much more invasively. And then we have, so the little non-showy flowers will eventually develop into yellow or orange fruit later in the summer. And I think, I'm not really sure how much of the fruit is spread later in the season, but the fruit does stay on, similarly to Japanese barberry and some others, into the late fall. So birds may spread it that way. I also want to caution that if you find these vines around the holidays, please do not harvest them and make wreaths out of them and then throw them into your compost after the holidays, because that is a chance that you could be spreading this seed. So this one, I know we're kind of focused on forests a little bit for this topic. This one you'll find more on roadsides, but you also will find on streams beds and on riparian areas. So you could have it in sort of forest edge. It does like wet soils. And this, however, this one is not a woody shrub. This is a herbaceous plant. So it does a lot of growth. It can grow really tall just in one growing season. And this one is, it's Japanese knotweed. It's sometimes also, people like to call it Japanese bamboo or Mexican bamboo. It's not a bamboo. It's not in the grass family. It's actually in the buckwheat family, which is similar to rhubarb and smartweeds. It's native to Eastern Asia, and again, it arrived as an ornamental and erosion control in North America. It has these large, almost heart-shaped leaves. There is also a giant bamboo or giant knotweed that we don't really see around here, but it has almost double or triple the size of the leaves. That's more cropping up in southern New England. So you will look for these leaves. It's herbaceous growth. Has the stems are hollow. You can kind of see from that picture, it's got this hollow stem, hence the sort of bamboo comparison. And it'll have small white flowers about this time of year in midsummer. Think of that flower of your rhubarb in your backyard that's coming up, similar to that. But the problem with this thing is that and the reason I kind of bring it up here as our top 5 is it's very difficult to control, especially if you're just going to do mechanical control. But even if you're going to do a mix of mechanical and chemical control. And the reason it does that is because it does well regrowing vegetatively or asexually, meaning what it does is it can, from very small root fragments in the rhizomes, grow into a new plant and kind of start a new population. And so the problem usually around here isn't so much about the fruit, kind of blowing around in the wind. It's more of pieces of the roots and the rhizomes in the soil being redistributed via construction material, on roadsides, things like that, or waterways. That's why you tend to see that after like a big, storm event that maybe washes a lot of this along waterways, it'll spread that way. And then, you get the fresh disturbed soil and it'll just take off from there. So that's one reason I include in here, is just because it is very difficult to manage. It's one that we've been seeing come up more and more sites that we manage in the last handful of years. So keep a lookout on this one. And certainly once it does get started, basically nothing else can grow under it, forest or not. So I guess that's all I have for now.
Thank you so much for that. And we do have a bunch of questions, so let's jump in. We have a few questions about browntail moth for Mike. And maybe overall, Mike, if people find these pests in their backyard, what would the state like them to do with that information? Is there a way for them to contact you, to share a photo of it, or what's the best way for people to contact the state with what they think they might have in their backyard?
Right. So, yeah, in terms of browntail moth, I mean, we are certainly happy to take calls. It is one insect that we're pretty much aware that it is everywhere, unlike some of these other ones. But yeah, again, if you'd like to call, we're always happy to field those calls. We do have a 211 line, because of the amazing volume of calls. So that's a great source of information, as well as, all the information we curate on the Maine Forest Service website. So Browntail gets a lot of the attention and stuff there. So, but yeah, people are absolutely free to call the lab, and we'll give out whatever recommendations we can.
Stephanie had a question. If browntail moth is in her yard, what should she be looking for to eradicate? She's been killing the moths, but what about the caterpillars?
Right. So, unfortunately, pretty much none of these forest pests will ever be able to be truly eradicated, so completely rid of. But we can do some minimal things. Browntail is particularly difficult to manage, but basically with the life cycle, the caterpillars really begin to feed in right around bud burst, and then they mature at that point. So at that point in the season, there is a window where folks can spray herbicides. So there's a couple herbicides recommended for browntail moth. Some available to homeowners, but certainly a lot of arborist and pesticide applicator companies are getting involved with browntail management. So we do maintain a list of all those arborists depending on your location, and pesticide applicators as well. So, there is spray management that can happen in that spring window. A lot of times the damage gets really out of control before people start to notice it. And at that point, the spraying is not as effective. So it's really effective against the younger larvae. And so at this time of the year, or probably, I haven't seen any very recently, the moths have already, come and gone. So they've laid eggs, egg masses on the leaves of trees there. And I did see a question about preferred hosts. So red oak, certainly one of the preferred hosts in the forest setting. Otherwise, crab apples and apples, really preferred hosts, and I've seen a lot of activity on Norway maple, another invasive tree here in Maine. But anyways, so once those eggs hatch, the caterpillars will do a little bit of feeding, and then they'll build a winter web, and that's how they overwinter. So they hatch out, in 1 year, and they don't begin to continue their development until the following spring. So those winter webs, once you learn to look for them, are very apparent, and where they're reachable, homeowners themselves can go out and prune those out in the winter months for population control. But again, on mature trees, there are arborists that are willing to do that work, physically prune out the webs and stuff like that. So those are kind of the best management tools we have at the time being. Like I said, not a lot of attention was being paid to browntail moth, because there was plenty of other, serious issues going on, and that's usually where the research tends to go. But there is an increasing body of research coming out for management of browntail moths. So we hope that there'll be some more techniques and stuff we can recommend to people in the near future.
Kathy had a question. She's wondering if the disease that has affected the red pines on MDI has spread to the mainland?
Yeah, so any of you that have been to MDI in recent history have probably seen the state of the red pine, and I just jumped in on this. Jesse might have some comments after as being the local authority, but there are a couple things affecting the red pine in that area. So in terms of what Kathy might be referring to, there's a couple of needle blights. So Diplodia and Syrococcus are the common ones that are kind of present everywhere in the environment. It just depends on how much they affect the trees. But there is also an invasive insect issue associated with those trees potentially. So that's red pine scale. Again, a very, not well studied insect from overseas that's been found on Mount Desert Island, and it's another one of these tiny insects. So it is actually wind dispersed, and so it has blown off we think. But yeah, I wrote it down before actually. So Hancock Point, Surrey, Sorrento, and Gouldsboro are a couple of the neighboring towns on the mainland where we have a documented red pine scale just pretty recently. So there's going to be a lot more to come in the red pine scale story. And yeah, we're starting to ramp up our efforts on understanding the role that red pine scale is playing with those other pathogens that are attacking red pine.
Here's one for you, Jesse. What can a homeowner do to stop the Asiatic bittersweet? What should the state of Maine be doing, and what does your team do on MDI to help eradicate this plant?
That's a good question, because what we may do in the park is not necessarily what a homeowner might do. Certainly, you know, we've got a lot more acreage possibly to manage than somebody's backyard. However, a lot of these invasive, you know, foresters have problems with as well in kind of that large forest setting. You know, I like to recommend not ever one method, because it usually doesn't work. And we use an integrated pest management approach, which basically means we monitor and we use different control methods. I guess what I do at I've got at my house, unfortunately, I've got, I think, all of those species I just showed you, except for knotweed, plus a handful more. So I've got a great testing ground. The bittersweet, if you can catch it early enough, you can hand pull it out. The problem is that if you don't get all the roots, it'll just sprout up again from that. But like with a lot of these, if you want to just do manual or mechanical control, if you are willing to stay on it through the course of a season and over years, you can starve the plant out of its carbohydrates, and so it'll eventually kill it. The problem is that it may take a long time, and particularly with the knotweed that I mentioned, you know, you're going to have to cut it back, mow it 5 times a season for about 5 years to probably be able to have hope of getting rid of even a small population. So so it depends. So you can get over-the-counter herbicides, you know, kind of from big box stores or local hardware stores. We do use herbicides in the park, and the thing I'll caution about that is that you want to make sure you follow the label, because the label is the law on the herbicide label, and kind of stick to that. And some of the herbicides are usable near waterways, and some are definitely not. And so that's kind of you know, you want to look at both the health hazards to the environment as well as to yourself. So for bittersweet in particular, though, I think that's one where if it's a mature one, you might be best, you know, that's already wrapped up around a big tree, and you just want to make sure it doesn't kill it. What you can do is you can cut it at about, you know, head height and just leave it there and not try to tear it out, because you might break branches off. And then cut it again at the base and try to manage it down at the ground level, so that when new, you know, things spiral up, you can stay on top of that. And that's basically what we do in the park. It's really difficult for those real small seedlings. I would recommend hand pulling if there's just a few of them. See if you can stay up on top of it. Otherwise, you'll want to go probably the chemical route.
That sounds like the most annoying plant to have in your yard because it's
one of them.
Yeah. You know, they grow so fast. Deb had a question about red pine. And she wants to know, have there been any pockets of red pine identified that have survived the die-off in recent years? And what was the disease or insect that was causing the damage?
So yeah, Mike already mentioned it was red pine scale primarily that did it. We had the Diplodia and Syrococcus already in red pines and MDI, and so red pines were not doing so well initially before the Maine Forest Service confirmed in late 2014 in Mount Desert. And so I guess the short answer is yes, there are still live red pine on MDI, not many. And certainly not many large stands, and not many that I've seen that have, you know, full green, you know, needle, you know, canopy, whether it's from any of the diseases that you know, Mike mentioned, or the insect, the scale. So we'll see. We did a little kind of a baseline inventory as soon as we documented red pine scale around the park, as well as some other private lands around the area, to try to get a sense on where red pine was. We had hoped to redo that study to kind of see how far along, or how, what's the decay rate and the mortality been. We were going to do that, then the pandemic hit, and so that had to be kind of put on hold. But just looking anecdotally, most of them are dead or dying, and unfortunately, most of them succumb within just a couple of years here, or they have within 2 or 3 years. But there may be some that hold out, and we'll see. That will be really interesting.
Maud emailed a question in before this event, and she wanted to know if poison ivy is considered an invasive species.
No, at least not by us. At least for the Park Service, we're bound by our management policies, and we try to stick to that. And so there's actually a definition of what we deem invasive and exotic. And while it can incorporate native species, another example might be cattail. People might think of that, is just growing aggressively. So I would put poison ivy in the category of aggressive, but we don't consider it invasive because we really are focusing on non-native species that are that. However, it absolutely can grow pretty well. It likes disturbed soils. It likes these open areas like other invasive plants. And so we really try to stay hands off, except for when it grows into areas that have a lot of visitor traffic or people traffic, and there's sort of that human health component. So we will manage very small areas, kind of along around the Ocean Path area, the Ocean Drive. But I'll just put a plug in for poison ivy. I'm very sensitive to it. I've worked with it, and I break out in rashes. But I really it's got a benefit. It has wildlife feed off of it, and so it's got a place here. I will mention though that it's interesting with climate change and increased CO2 in the air. It's kind of predicted that a lot of vine species will do well with that. They tend to grow better and grow more during that growing season. So I'm kind of curious to see if both poison ivy being a vine and other vines, if we'll tend to see more of that cover around this area of the world as temperatures increase and CO2 increases.
Yeah, you so eloquently led right into my next question, which was submitted by Rosemary. Should we view these species as natural due to climate change?
The ones that I'm talking about, not really, because they were ones that we introduced a while ago, and they came from elsewhere where they didn't usually bring the pathogens or the pests that keep them in check, and so they were able to have that competitive advantage. But I think that brings up this kind of an interesting, I don't know if this is getting exactly to the question, but thinking about how species ranges are going to shift with warming temperatures and different precipitation events and patterns. That's certainly going to happen, and that's going to have an effect. A lot of these invasive species will actually do better. They tend to do better with the changing conditions and the warmer temperatures than do our native plants in this area, which is kind of unfortunate, because we're kind of in the business to kind of keep our native ecosystems as resilient, meaning they can kind of, they may shift, but they can bounce back with some of these disturbances. So I would say that with some native species that are native to, let's say, southern New England, but not so much native to this area of Maine, it'll be interesting to see what happens with those species range shifts. And so that is something that Park is looking at. Some of them, most of them are not really considered invasive. One I would consider something to take a real extra look at is black locust, which is a tree, which is already around here. It's widely used culturally. It's not native to here. It can act pretty invasively and aggressively and change some of the soil nutrient characteristics. So that one I think will be interesting to see, right? If it's something that we want to encourage, or that's something that we see spreads due to changing range limits. There are others that we all are looking at, certainly. But for the ones that we're talking about here, they're non-native and we consider invasive, and with climate change, they're still not ones we want to have around.
What about your side of the coin, Mike? I know that a lot of these pests come in through firewood. Is climate change going to affect these pests and how they end up in Maine?
Yeah, well, climate change is certainly, an important thing for insect survival. one of the classic questions we always get is, what's the cold temperature that'll, kill emerald ash borer? So unfortunately, insects that are so well adapted to everything, they can withstand temperatures of up to -40. So we're not going to get those cold temperatures necessarily that used to be pretty reliable and cause big die-offs, if we, as we become more and more invaded by something like emerald ash borer. Hemlock woolly Adelgid is another good example for Maine here. It hasn't really spread as aggressively as we were worried. It's been pretty static in its distribution, its natural movement, and a lot of studies from other places kind of link that to climate on both ends. They do succumb to quite a bit of winter mortality, but then they also have on the other end of the spectrum there's some information that they also don't do well when the temperature is too hot in the summer months on the other side there. So yeah, certainly it affects insect survivability. And I believe there was a write-in question, which maybe you're going to get to. Somebody was concerned about browntail moth sneaking in a second generation this year. So I believe what you're probably seeing, hopefully, is fall webworm is becoming really active now. There shouldn't be large browntail caterpillars around at all right now. But yeah, the winter months are actually a pretty important milestone for insect development. And depending on the species, a lot of them actually require that cold in the winter to calibrate and set their internal clock to know their development and stuff like that. So yeah, browntail is one of those, fortunately. So we hopefully the problem will not get any worse in terms of we shouldn't expect 2 generations at any point, just the one. But that's quite enough to deal with.
Well, we're almost at the end, but there was one more question that was emailed in from Tom that I thought you two could take a stab at. Tom wants to know what the chief obstacles are that Acadia National Park and the Maine Forest Service face that hinder maybe a more effective effort to control these invasive species in Maine.
I guess the ability to stay ahead of controlling these species, especially newly found populations. We've had an invasive plant management program for over 30 years at Acadia, although it was focused on 1 or 2 species for this first half, and really even the last decade or 15 years, we've ramped it up to more species, but we keep finding more and more populations, right? So staying ahead of it is always a challenge, both like personnel capacity, all that. Preventing the spread from an area outside of the park or outside of our area, that you're managing, and within the park. So that could be, because of people or wildlife, or the wind just dispersing, and be able to get that, kind of prevention end of things down. I guess a long-term obstacle, I would say, dealing with environmental change and warming temperatures, like I said, and sort of the shifting precipitation patterns as well. We've, at least here, it's mostly been, a lot of dry summers recent, and that does a number on our native plant resources, and it kind of maybe, pests do better perhaps, or some of them. And so it's sort of these like short-term, what we're dealing with now, and then also the long-term projection scenarios that I find are going to be quite challenging. And then making sure we get the word out that, this is an important, important thing that's really needed for good forest health is management of invasive species.
Let's see, for the Maine Forest Service here, from an insect standpoint, invasive insect standpoint, I would say that probably the clearest and biggest obstacle is the unexpected. So, we can know the insects we study really well. We can understand how they move naturally and stuff like that, but it's the unexpected movements, and introductions. So the first introduction of an insect into the state, look at emerald ash borer. We have it in, the southernmost part of the state and the northernmost part of the state, nowhere in between. So that we know of yet, and when it does show up in those middle territories, that'll likely be the cause is unintentional human movement and things like firewood and stuff like that. So, we're dealing with that. We have, areas we can watch, but you just never know sometimes. And, these insects, they build up these populations without a sign pretty quickly, and they can be in an area for quite a while before we have any idea, and then management becomes a game of catch up. And, you know, again, Emerald Ash for a classic poster child for that. And just the accumulation of invasive species in a place like Maine, I believe it's on an average of every 2 to 3 years, we acquire a new invasive insect, and the ones that we got 2 to 3 years earlier, they don't go away. So, you know, it's being stretched really thin and trying to keep tabs on all these invasive species that are just, quite aggressive sometimes. So it's just a climbing up the hill.
Well, it's obvious that both of your teams work really hard to do what you do. And so I just wanted to thank you both for taking the time to come here and talk with us a little bit about what our forests are seeing plant-wise and pest-wise. So thank you both for coming tonight. And thanks to all of you for coming and watching. I hope that you join us again. And Jesse, Mike, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it. And to everybody, have a great night.
Everyone.
Thanks for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.